You must understand that the vampire was my friend. I stood under a bright light, which made it difficult for me to see anything. When a group of people was led into my section, I felt them as breath and shuffling feet, their presence more a sensed mass than individual faces. Eyes would sometimes gleam at me, flashes of spectacles, and when I felt their presence filling the tent, I began my performance. I was supposed to dance, to leap, to caper, clownish stuff. The important thing was the laughter. There had to be laughter. There had to be laughter because of the other presence in the tent, unseen, but always there. Professor Nadoni himself. He would secrete himself in a dark corner and watch. He watched all the acts, and sometimes you could see sticking out of the shadows the long, thin form of his bull whip. He drank, and he was a violent man. We all knew the story of Billy Nolan, the poor boy with claws for hands, who had been so unfortunate as to push a child that had tormented him somewhere in Illinois. Poor Billy Nolan had fallen in love with one of the girls from the trapeze act, and it had made it hard to take the insults. So he pushed the little girl, a true monster, I'm told. And Professor Nadoni was out of his dark corner like a shot and dragged poor Billy away. He set the whip to work, and well, the problem with Professor Nadoni was that once he was good and drunk, he didn't know when to stop. He laid bare the boy's spine with that whip. You could see the bones shimmer in the gore, white as glazed china. They buried Billy Nolan the next morning, and the girl from the trapeze, wept when he went into the ground wrapped in a bloody piece of canvas. So I made sure they laughed. That's all. I made sure of that. I had one friend in those days. One friend in the world. His tent was set up at a little distance from ours. He wasn't considered part of the freaks, no. His was a different kind of act. The vampire. You step away from the lights of the show towards a black tent set up in the shadows. Enter if you dare. Pay your nickel and see the last descendant of Vlad Dracul, imprisoned by a secret charm, kept alive, fed on the blood of pigs. And you walk into the black velvet tent, down a narrow passage. No music. No noise at all. You can hear your own breath. And down there, at the end, there it is, lit by flickering lanterns. A coffin, standing upright. Come closer. There he is, my friend. Tall, regal, as pale as any corpse. the lips drawn back so you can see dagger-like fangs, nails long and sharpened. People would stand and stare in silence at him in his coffin. Oh, he was a fine vampire, my friend. They got their nickel's worth of fear in that tent. Nobody ever laughed. I longed for it, you know? The darkness, the hushed fear. It was magnificent. Of course he was fake, but in a sense he wasn't. His real name was Joshua Todt. His teeth were real, filed to dangerous fangs. He showed me that my own existence was a small thing, a limited thing. Not a desperate eternity without relief, but an episode. There was so much more. It was very good to hear that, to feel it. It was good to be his friend. I know that he longed with every fiber of his heart to be real. We came to the valley for the first time in late spring, the hill country. Things were different for us there, profitable, but hard. It was an isolated place, rich, clean, neat farms, settled since the 17th century. Strong stock of people. And when I danced, when I threw my hat in the air and did my cartwheels, I heard a little girl's voice saying, "I hate the little man." And then something hit me in the head, hard enough to draw blood. And they laughed. Inbred little brutes. We all noticed it. Things were thrown, acts were interrupted. But the oddest thing about those people had to do with the vampire act. Nobody went to it. I discussed this with my friend late at night. "Come with me," he said. "Come for a walk." We left the woods and followed the dusty road until it turned into the town's main street, and all was silent around us. Lights were on in the houses, but not a soul was in the streets. I saw it at once. At one of the windows, a cross was hung, and next to it, shimmering whitely, was a bunch of fresh garlic. I understood. A death must have occurred right before our arrival in the valley. "Let's leave," whispered my friend, and of course he was right. We were in danger here. People in such fear catching us wandering about their village after a bad death could do things. Mobs had burned men for far less. We spoke little on our way back to the camp. I thought of the people cowering in their beds, listening for noises, praying to be spared. And when the sun came up, they would set out for the show again, and some girl would yell that she hated the little man. And all of their fear and their anger at their own superstition would find release, and a bottle would fly and blood would flow. Professor Nadoni, in typical fashion, adjusted very quickly to the local audience we faced. So in the days leading up to the festival, he developed a new show, a new lineup of thrills and excitements for the people of the valley. For 10 cents, you could now throw a pie at a freak. Throw it hard. They can take it. freaks have hard heads. And if you feel like throwing anything else, a pebble, perhaps, or a tin can, well, who's to say anything about it as long as you paid your dime first? I had just washed the blood off my face after my last stint as a target, and I went to the back of the camp, where my friend's black tent was. I needed to talk to him, needed his counsel and sympathy, and more than anything, his vision of a grand world of possibilities. I stopped when I saw the woman. She was beautiful, pale, marble head with long black hair above a slender frame hidden by a flowing cloak. She stood contemplating the black tent, and there was a smile on her face that was both wise and far away. Then, without seeming to move at all, she entered the tent. A glide it was, perfectly still and smooth, and I stood alone in the night in wonder. I sat down to wait. She did not come out. The camp grew quiet and still, and I was watching the black tent, and not a sound emerged. It stood in perfect stillness. She came back. She came back every night, disappearing into the vampire's tent and not emerging until an hour before dawn. I did not begrudge her the time with my friend. I couldn't begrudge her anything. She was, in her cold and remote way, the most beautifully perfect woman I've ever seen. I withstood my daily torment and kept my sanity because I knew I would see her at night. My one moment of beauty, stillness, in all the madness. She was hypnotic, and I knew I would speak with my friend at last, and he would tell me everything he knew about her mystery, and we would all be connected, drawn together in a silent night that was all promise and silence and dignity. It should have been a shock when, after an interval of several days, I at last saw my friend face to face again. It would have been a shock because any physical transformation of a familiar face shocks. Death, moving closer, always does. But it wasn't shocking to me. No. I knew who she was. I had come to realize it, watching her. She was the bad death. My friend was lying on a cot in the very depths of his black tent. He lay with his eyes closed, and I tiptoed to his side and reached out and slowly turned his head. And I saw 2 red marks on his neck, frayed, strangely dry holes. The signs of a slow death that ends in unnatural life. And then, just as in his act, his eyes opened. They were weak now, nearly drained of life. He whispered, "One more night," and nodded. He smiled at me, and I could see his fangs gleaming in the light, and I trembled. "Oh, my friend," he said with a fading voice, the voice of the grave. "My good friend, I'm happy." And I backed away as he sank into a deep sleep, and before I left his tent, I took from the shelves the mad Frenchman's book about the undead, because I knew right then that there were things walking in this valley that were unnameable, and that I would have to make a decision soon about one thing: life or death. I secreted myself under one of the wagons, and I wept, for I knew what had happened, and so I cried for my friend and his longing. I cried for his deep voice saying like a child, "I'm happy." Again I read. The entire night the mad Frenchman's voice was my guide. Death of a vampire. How to kill. You burn the heart, of course. Separate the head from the body. Bury both face down, the mouth stuffed with roses and garlic. Also, if burning is impractical, the heart may be pierced by a stake. Why was I confident that I could find them? Because I knew my friend's mind, of course. In that entire valley which cowered in fear and looked for answers and solutions, looked for comfort and knowledge, only I possessed it. The heart must be burned, a stake driven through the chest. I slept all that day in the heat, through the worry and the guessing and the fear. I slept through the night, through the hunt and the prayers and the tears. I slept to be ready. I slept because I would be the one to undo my friend and his beautiful shadow. I dreamt of madness, of dancing for the dead, of going on a nightly quest, of being spat upon before slaying a dragon. The old church. We had passed it, my friend and I, on our way to the village that night. It had fallen into ruin long ago, walls crumbling, brush growing first over the paths, then the stones, at last climbing up the still proud steeple. I knew with the utmost certainty that this is where he had gone now. I set out to the ruined church. The dark was just beginning to turn, the coming of light sensed rather than seen. By now there were noises coming from some of the houses I passed. Cows were mooing from the stables. Milking time. I heard doors closing, muffled voices. Then I was on the road again, out of the village and on my way. If I hadn't had my mind on the things I was about to do, if I hadn't been mentally investigating the ruined church, I would have seen them coming. There were 4 of them. The oldest looked to be about 14, the youngest 10. "Look," one of them said. "It's a freak." I nodded as I passed them, saying, "Good morning," trying to get away on manners. I took a few more steps when I heard the voice behind me. "Hey, freak! Hey, stubby!" Then something hit me on the head, cold and wet. I reached up and my hand came away yolky. Then another egg hit me and I heard them laughing, and as I dropped the stakes and stood there being pelted, listening to them taunting me and laughing as they threw their eggs, I knew that I was lucky, and they weren't out for blood, and that in a minute or so they would let me run. Fortune was with me. When they had gone laughing down the road, I picked my stakes up from the dust. I had lost time. There was a pale color to the world now. The church was close. I was sweating, and my muscles hurt from carrying the heavy stakes. I stumbled on down that road, and at last saw the ruined steeple, and then the walls. A bird called. then flew away, and there was utter silence in the forest, the silence that marks the line between night and day, the breath after the long nightmare. Then I heard far away the crying of a child, sounding terribly across the dark, silent forest. The sound came closer, desperate and lost. Then a dark growl, as of a wolf, and then the silence again, the terrible silence following a done deed. Then I saw them, and I stuffed my hand into my mouth to keep from screaming. They came from the shadows like mist, side by side, at a slow walk. My friend's mouth was smeared with blood, and his lady carried in her arms the limp and white body of the dead child. They reached the door, and for a moment, as they entered, their flowing elegance and regal, awful dignity disappeared. They bent over as they entered the church, and with the blood and the corpse, and the animal shine in their eyes, with their blood-stained fangs, they were, for the moment, revealed as beasts, the red-eyed things they were, driven by appetite and bloodlust. Their beauty, at that moment, was gone, and only the inhuman thing that animated them was visible. And it was that which almost made me lose my mind in a scream and run madly into the forest and flee this cursed spot. I had found them. I picked up my stakes, held them tight, and when the first ray of the morning sun broke through the trees, when the first bird began to sing, then more, I rose from my watching place and approached the ruined church and went into the blackness. Morning had not happened inside. The thick walls deadened all sound, and the air was stifling and old. I stood still and listened, and there was a draft somewhere in the walls that sounded like a low whistle. Then a single ray of light began to travel across the wall, slowly. Then another. The sun was rising, gaining on the dark. I felt a surge of panic course through my body that shook me. But I didn't run. Stared down the stairs into the crypt. Was this a dream? I looked at the stakes in my hands, and they had no reality. Something was moving there. Something was squirming like a worm in a small crevice of the wall. It was white and small, and at last I realized it was looking at the dead child. It wiggled and twisted, so maggot-like in its pale repulsiveness that I gagged. The dead thing tried to squirm further into the crevice, and I realized that it felt the ray of sunlight moving closer across the wall, and was trying to get away. It made a gurgly hiss, and at last disappeared in the shadows of the cracked wall, lodged in there tightly, and the last I saw of it was the teeth opening and closing on themselves. I went down, looking for the source. The crypt was low. The atmosphere was that of a coffin. No sound reached here. They would be in the furthest corner of the crypt. I could hear my own breath. And there, at the very end of the narrow crypt, a tomb. It was massive, hewn of stone. The letters Mason were written on its side in withered script, but I knew that whoever had been the owner of this burial place was no longer here. What slept there now had not been buried in a church under an altar. It had crept in one night, and as if to confirm my thoughts, I stepped on a thing that cracked loudly under my foot, and, looking down, beheld a pile of bones tossed carelessly onto the floor. The heavy top of the tomb was ajar. A slight crack remained between the frame and the cover, and all the feeling of evil and doom that permeated the place came from that little hole. What lay in there wasn't dead, and I stared into the small opening until I thought it would go mad. Then I inserted one of the heavy stakes and pulled on it like a lever, and with a loud, grating movement, the tomb slid open. I stood gazing down at it, at both of them. They lay together and they held each other. My friend looked as if asleep, and I remembered his words to me. I'm happy. I watched their hands, which were intertwined, and thought of my friend's long years of solitude and loneliness. Happy. I raised the stake and placed it against his chest. It would be a release. He wasn't alive any longer. I was the only one. The only one to save this family. I raised the hammer, looking away from the hands intertwined. Goodbye, old friend, I thought. Goodbye. And a fly alighted on my forehead and changed it all. I don't know where it came from. It must have followed me down into the dark. It landed on my forehead, and, a reflex, I dropped the stake and swatted at it, and I touched my forehead as I did. The fly disappeared. My hand was sticky. I brought it down before my eyes, and it smelled of eggs. I looked down upon the body of my friend and his lady. I looked at my hand, and then, fearing my thoughts, I dropped to my knees and searched frantically for the lost stake. I found it, and again it was pressed against my friend's chest. And I raised the hammer, and I knew it came down to me. Life and death. There was no one else. And yet, entire regions have in this way been depopulated. I could save them. And yet, evil things that crawled out of their holes at night and preyed upon. And yet, a new word, a chilling word. Revenge. I had never, ever thought of it before. My hands trembled. Entire regions. Revenge. My hands shook, and slowly it dawned on me that I was smiling, thinking of them in their beds. I could save them all. There wasn't anyone else. He was my friend. Miserable. I whispered. Then louder, miserable bastards. I hadn't smiled in years. One year later, on our trip to the west, Professor Nadoni's traveling circus passed through that valley again. Yes, I still danced for a nickel, did cartwheels, and all the rest. And yes, Nadoni still drank and threatened. That didn't change. No, at least not yet. But the valley, oh, the valley had changed. We didn't stop there this time. There was nowhere to stop. The village had disappeared. It was a kind of place you passed in silence and with a feeling of dread. Yes, the valley had changed. There wasn't any laughter anymore. No laughter at all.